This is a follow-up to yesterday's video talking about why rugby viewership for the Rugby World Cup was so high and it's just fallen off a cliff in most cases when it comes to going back to watching domestic or provincial rugby, except that is for France, where the audience seems to be holding up quite well. What are they doing so well that other countries aren't doing, and why can we not get the passion for rugby through the World Cup transferring into the domestic club game? Lots of interesting points, and the reason I'm doing this follow-up video is because there were so many brilliant comments that were left on the video, so thank you very much for that. I'm going to feature a load of them here because it's really got me thinking, and it just goes to show your comments are very important. Get them down below, tell me what you think. Give the video a thumbs up as well, that helps spread the word because it is just me. I'm Tim, this is Egg Chasers, and maybe this will be the video where, if I haven't already, I will earn your subscription. So on with the comments then, and the first one, and I'd summarise this. Now, look, the most popular comment about why are people not watching domestic rugby after watching the Rugby World Cup, the most common answer was connected to the paywall and the fact rugby costs money to watch. And I will get to that one at the end. But some of the other ones that were mentioned, like this one from £1 Steaks, great name by the way, says, basically I'd summarise this as rugby is boring. He says, I can't bear watching anymore. TMO, water breaks, clock stop, terrible pop music pumped into the stadium during breaks. Get rid of the TMO except for the acts of scoring a try. Get rid of the water and injury breaks. Players can leave the field. And no more stopping the clock. Let's go back to injury time, and maybe a ref will be embarrassed if there's 30 minutes added on at the end of a match. Just on that one, you know we get this statistic for ball in play time. I have wondered whether having a clock counting up the ball in play time might act as a bit of an incentive for referees and players to just get a shuffle on, because it'd be quite embarrassing if that ball in play time was low while a game is on. Bit of carrot and the stick maybe. I doubt that one will happen, but you know, just a thought. And any more thoughts, like I say, leave them in the comments. It's interesting that £1 Steak makes that comment because Matthew Raynal only yesterday, one of the referees at the World Cup, said he disagrees with the TMO bunker being used. He says it got brought in too soon, hadn't been tried out enough, and it's not like rugby to change the rules just like that and not think about the unintended consequences, is it? That's not like rugby at all. My goodness me. Anyway, Matthew Raynal said that he was frustrated that he wasn't able to explain the decisions to the audience that were watching. And yeah, that's one of the biggest issues with the bunker, which I've talked about on many videos. Matthew Raynal also said he would quite like to do media after the game so that he could explain some of his decisions. I'd be up for that if he's game on. On the subject of rugby being boring, Alex Wilson asked his 11-year-old son recently why he didn't like watching the rugby on the telly with him, and said the game's boring, it's always stopping and scrums take forever. I can only add that my son, who plays rugby every Sunday, trains in the week, he doesn't watch the game at all. And I don't know if maybe it's the TikTok generation, shorter attention spans and all of that, but there's clearly an issue with the next generation coming through. And, well, I don't know, on the scrums taking forever, on that point, I did mention on the video yesterday that in France, in South Africa, they seem to have an appreciation and a love of the scrum that maybe isn't there in other countries. And I think part of that is, and I've had some comments on the French game from people in the video yesterday, and a bunch of them were saying that the kind of nuances and the detail of the sport is taught from the grassroots level up to youngsters. So they grow up with this appreciation of the scrum. And I wonder if that's an element of it. And when I think about watching the World Cup and the way that rugby's broadcast, and I've done a lot of work in rugby broadcasting, so I think I'm speaking from a position that I know something about here. I think rugby sometimes talks down to its audiences, particularly when it's like big events like Six Nations, World Cups, when there's a lot of casual fans on it. It feels like it has to talk down to the people that aren't the big initiated rugby fans, and I think that's wrong. And I look at the NFL, which never does that, and it has a massive audience. And I remember when I first started watching NFL, some of what they were talking about would go over my head, but I sort of had to dig in and learn it. And yeah, I don't know. It's just a thought. I think rugby could do a bit of that sometimes. The next point then, in terms of comments on rugby, I'd move on from rugby is boring to the games don't mean a lot to people. In terms of domestic rugby, Colin here says, it's not actually domestic rugby. The competitions are full of other countries, so who cares? I think there's something in this, you know. History, rivalry, that is important. It's why the Six Nations is the biggest annual rugby tournament in the world. Those rivalries go back decades, centuries in some cases, particularly in English, French rugby. Some of these rivalries go back generations, and that's really important. There's a great example of this going on this weekend. As Driver points out, the biggest club game in the world takes place this weekend. Leinster versus Munster. The Aviva Stadium is a 52,000 all-seater sellout. The viewing audience will be 1 million on RTE, which is free to air. Like I said, I'll talk about that whole free to air paywall thing in a minute. I'll come back to that. But these are the games. It's not just about league points in the URC that people care about. In fact, they care about that far less in this game than just pure bragging rights over a rival. All that history, that story, all that emotion going into this game is why people care. And I spoke to a load of South African fans in France, and they still care about the Currie Cup for the same reason, and they find themselves unable to get into the URC as much for the same reason. So we have to leverage that history where it occurs, and it's why that in the URC, for example, those local rivalries are the ones. In some respects, until you get to the playoffs, they're kind of the only games people really care about at the moment, whilst these rivalries are still bedding in. Got a comment, again, another one, just saying that Leinster-Munster this weekend will be massive. Comment here from Jacob, who's a New Zealand fan, who says he is sick of so much rugby. I think this is a fantastic point that Jacob makes. It should be about quality, not quantity. We're always hearing about, rugby's financially struggling. Clubs are going bust, unions are running out of money, and what's rugby's solution been? It's been to play more rugby, more games, because that's more money. It may well be more money in the short term, but what are the long-term consequences of taking that approach? I think it's to slowly kill the game and create apathy, because what we now have are international games where the stadiums that are half full because people want to have an extra international game tagged on the end, and it just doesn't capture people's imagination in the same way. Look at the Heineken Champions Cup, one of my favourite competitions, or it was. When I think about that, I used to love it when I was growing up. Absolutely love it. The stories, the clubs, the rivalries. And this was the best of the best. Outside of international games, this was the highest quality rugby you could find. And it still is when you get to the finals, but the pool stages are a mess now, because you've expanded the competition to the point where there are teams that should never be in that competition, playing in that competition. And as a result, you might make a bit more money from having some more TV games on right now, but what you've actually done is ruined what was great about that competition and made it far less enjoyable. Also, what does rugby talk about all the time at the minute? Player welfare. Player welfare is the most important thing. Is it Eck? No. If player welfare was the most important thing, as they say, they'd play fewer games. But they'll never do that because they're chasing the cash now. They don't really care about player welfare. They want to be seen to care about player welfare. So what do? Play more games, which isn't good for welfare, and they introduce loads of rules to make it look like they care. So we end up getting these ridiculous red and yellow cards given for things which are accidents and people can't help, and you get TMO bunkers, and you get the community game having to play different rules to the elite game for some strange reason in England. Rubbish. Play less, the games will be better. That's just my thoughts. Scarcity has a value. Great example of that is the NFL, which has 18 rounds of games? And so 9 home games in a season for most clubs, most sides. And it's multi-billion-dollar industry because scarcity has a value. Less is sometimes more. And it's why the Six Nations, the Rugby World Cup are so good. It's because there's not much of it. So what there is gold dust. Anyway, moving on to the next point then. And I think I may genuinely need glasses because I can't read what that says. Oh yeah, just linking back to the complicated laws and too much rugby, linking them together. And this comment here talks about rugby fatigue. There's so much noise, there's so much controversy, analysis, so many takes on the game. I get information overload. And having to keep up with the game itself is only half of the drama it's these days. Yeah, I mean, there's so many things I could say about that. Simplifying the laws to help. I'll do a video another day on why I think getting rid of the knock-on in rugby could really help. I know that seems insane, but I'll save it for another day. I think it will work. Anyway, And then on rugby fatigue, Brendan, who's South African fan, says, I'm struggling to care for the URC right now. I will get into it further down the line, but there's been so much rugby consumed in October with so many highs, it's just not sustainable. Again, less is more. And I've mentioned the NFL, and there's so much we can learn from that sport. The fact that less is more, the fact that you collectively try and grow the whole pie so that everyone has a bigger slice of it rather than just trying to keep hold of your little pie right now. But another sport that is thriving at the minute, as Andrew Imms points out, is the NRL, which had 3.4 million viewers for its NRL final, and they're expanding into the US next year. So again, he says quality is over the top. They have chants like they do at football matches. The reason New Zealand is trying to speed up the game and get rid of the TMO is because this is what it's competing against, and they are losing. Australian rugby has all but gone now as a result. Yes. There are only so many hours in a day. People's lives are busier than ever. They've got more options than ever. Rugby is in a competitive market, and in a lot of cases, it is losing out. Again, France, though, is a place, as I've pointed out on the video yesterday, that is doing really well. Why is that? Well, Just Red Devil says, it doesn't surprise me that French club rugby is doing so well. It's the most professional system in rugby. They have a fully independent league system. They have promotion and relegation. That is massive. So I've worked for the last, 7-8 years for BT Sport on English domestic rugby. And I can tell you that when relegation went, interest just nosedived. You couldn't tell the same stories anymore. And you know what? Sport is storytelling at the end of the day. And it's just not as compelling when there isn't the same level of jeopardy. It's massive. And also, that is how it doesn't work. I'm not saying relegation would work in every country, because there are some countries where that's never been a thing. It's always been a thing, and it is a thing in English sport, in British sport. People understand that. It's always been the case. So, well, certainly through the professional era in rugby union, it's always been the case. And in football, for decades and decades, it's always been the case. And you've definitely lost a certain something without that being there. Just Red Devil also goes on to talk about the URC and says, the URC is a bunch of nations that don't have the facilities to build an independent league system. It's a lesser version of the Champions Cup. What is the point in watching Zebre lose every week with 0 on the line as there's no relegation? Interesting. He says, recently in football, clubs attempted a breakaway league, the European Super League, if you remember that. He says that was going to be structured like the URC, and nobody wanted it. I do think there's something in that. And this sort of ties together a lot of the things that I've talked about so far. But the most common topic that came up on this subject of why there are not the same audiences for domestic rugby as for World Cup and international rugby, and it was the paywall. The fact you have to pay to watch rugby. Jigsaw, a Glasgow fan, says he cannot justify a subscription for because the URC is stuck behind a paywall. You've got Minnie Matthew just saying simply £30 a month. Will Luscombe saying you need to show games for free. The barrier is too high. Interestingly, so BT Sport, as mentioned, I worked on BT Sport. They had, I think it was maybe 5 or 6 regular season matches and 1 game every Heineken Cup weekend, and also the Premiership final, all shown on ITV, free to air. And that partnership worked really, really well. It put Premiership Rugby in the shop window, but they weren't handing away the rights to a free-to-air broadcaster for nothing. They were able to keep the valuable rights, but have a little shop window and a little bit of a taster for the casual rugby fan. And I think that worked really, really well. And they chose the games they were picking brilliantly. So, for example, there was the one at the London Stadium where there was 55,000, the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, where there was 55,000 fans there. Saracens v Harlequins, so a London derby. And I think 1.5 million people tuned in, or over 1 million anyway, which is really, really good. So, yes, the free-to-air point is a really, really good one. Lee Andrews says, many South Africans cannot afford Supersport. Yeah, I've heard how expensive it is relative to the average wage there. He said the government had to beg them to put some World Cup games on the national broadcaster. Yeah, it's interesting. And this is quite topical as well, because news that's just come out this week, well, in the last day or so, that the Six Nations may not be guaranteed to stay free to air. I know Owen Farrell's come out and talked about his reservations about Six Nations potentially going behind a paywall, because this opens it up. So there are, if you don't understand the situation, the way it works in the UK, there are some sporting occasions like the horse racing Grand National, like Wimbledon tennis, which have to be free to air. There's a bunch of these events, the boat race between Oxford and Cambridge, rowing, and so things that have cultural value and significance. And Six Nations is not one of these now. It's not guaranteed to have to stay free to air. So it could go to Amazon. It could go to basically the highest bidder. And now, one thing I always talk about with this is that one thing that never gets mentioned, that Six Nations is already behind a paywall, because the license fee is £159 a year, which you have to pay by threat of prison. So you do have to pay to watch the Six Nations on the BBC, but and you have to pay the BBC to watch ITV, who are a genuine free-to-air broadcaster. ITV is, but the point is, nearly 9 million people watched that World Cup semi-final against South Africa on ITV. You get about the same audience watching Six Nations games. That is a massive audience, and I'm totally sympathetic, and I agree with the people who say that some free-to-air rugby is really, really important for the sport. I maybe am not as persuaded by that as some people are, that is the silver bullet solution. And let me explain why. So I've got these numbers for you. So the average Premiership rugby game, which is now on TNT Sport, 250,000 would be a good audience, I'd suggest, based on what I know about Premiership rugby viewing figures. I'd say that would be quite good if it got 250,000 for a game. That would be solid, normal. The Premiership final, which was on BT Sport, or will be on TNT Sport this season, and was also on ITV, free to air, around about 1 million viewers. When you look at Six Nations or the World Cup, you're looking at more like 8 million viewers. So the reason I bring these up is, look, the Premiership final was on free to air. Anybody that wanted to could watch that, and 1 million people did. And what that says to me is there are 7 million people that only care about international rugby and are probably never going to care about the Premiership. And this goes for domestic rugby in all countries. The fact that France have managed to get their audience much closer to international rugby, as I talked about on the video yesterday, is nothing to do with it being free to air, and it's got everything to do with all of the other things that I've talked about on this video so far. This paywall argument is not the only solution, because if it was, that number would be way higher. Way higher. It's not about having free-to-air rugby, or at least that is not, in my opinion, the most important thing. In a way, and this sounds harsh, in a way, as a rugby fan who wants rugby to grow, I don't really care about the 7 million people that only watch the Six Nations in the World Cup, because they're only ever going to watch the Six Nations in the World Cup. They're never going to watch rugby regularly because they don't watch it when it's available to them just like that now on one of the free-to-air channels. So those 7 million people aren't important to rugby growing. What's important to rugby growing is growing this number from this number. These are the people that will watch club rugby. And how can we take some of that 1 million and grow this number here? That's what needs to happen. That's what needs to happen. That will also mean that you get stadiums for some of these clubs, which, I mean, the attendances have been dropping, and, you know, difficult financial circumstances at the minute. And I'm using England as an example, but I think this translates right across the board. And the way that you get some of that 1 million translating to that is by tapping into some of the other things we've talked about. So not constantly tinkering with the rules of rugby, playing less games but focusing on great games. Perfect example, tomorrow Leinster play Munster, and that will be an amazing occasion because it really matters. Whereas when Leinster plays Zebre, nobody cares. So have less games but have more meaningful games, and that will help up that number. Lean into the rivalry. Stop messing about with the rules. Make it easy to follow and easy to watch, because the rules have been simplified somewhat. What else did we talk about? I think those are the main points, aren't they? But if you do all of those other things that people have talked about on the video from yesterday, and which I've covered on this video, then what really matters isn't the 8 million people that watch the Six Nations and the World Cup, but it's the 1 million people that actually watch club rugby now, who aren't paying a subscription for TNT. That's my thought. So if you are one of the people that just watches the Six Nations and the Rugby World Cup, I'm not saying you're not important. I'm saying you're not important for growing the sport. First, we have to tap into these people. When all these people are wrapped up in this number, then you can start attacking. Hold on, what's going on with the people that don't really care about rugby that much and only watch every now and again? Because these people are never going to buy a shirt for a club. They're never going to buy a season ticket at a stadium. They're never going to buy a subscription to watch the domestic league. They just like the odd game. Some of them, I imagine, probably only watch it because they forgot to turn the channel over. It might be that simple. Anyway, there's my thoughts. I'd love to know yours. Some food for thought there. And thanks again for your comments. Get stuck in below. I will see you on the next video. By the way, coming very soon, I'm going to start doing my my player power rankings for the end of the year. I did them halfway through the year before the World Cup. Now let's look at who the top 10s in every position are as we take the World Cup into account. That will be starting very soon on the channel, so hit subscribe.